Good morning, everybody. Welcome to another session of Coach's Clinic, sponsored by Golden Home Fitness. I am the person who will run you through today's session, Coach JJ. And today we are going to address corrective exercises for the lumbo-pelvic hip complex. Now, I do want to start with this. If you are experiencing pain, discomfort, and what have you, things just seem really off with that region, then of course consult your physician or physical therapist, as they'll have a pretty good idea as to what may be going on or what might be off. But once you have done that, then these exercises that we'll go through at the end of today's session could be something you can apply to your everyday programming to help correct whatever needs to be addressed. Now, the purpose of today's session, will be to address the common deviations that may occur with the lumbopelvic hip complex, and also explain how some of the daily movements that you perform would actually, create some of these deviations you may experience. And then, of course, at the end, like I mentioned, we're going to demonstrate some of those exercises that you can apply to yourself for addressing these matters. And when it comes to the tools, all you'll need is just a little bit of floor space, right? Doesn't take much whatsoever. And also a mat, or as long as you have comfortable flooring, that should be fine as well. Also, certain massage tools we will need, such as, whether it be the one of these trigger point therapy canes, lacrosse balls. I have two of them here. You can also use one. You don't need two. Massage gun. I will also try to use the resistance loop right here as well, so a small band. And if you don't have any of these pieces of equipment, just like I mentioned in previous videos, you can absolutely visit our website at goldenhomefitness.com, and you can visit the shop page on that website to access any of the pieces of equipment that we see here, or anything else that you need for your fitness arsenal. But we're going to move on to talking more about that lumbopelvic hip complex and really what that region does. Actually, let me show you real quick, because it's really comprised of three bones, right? So I'm going to come closer to the camera here, and just to show you real quick, we have right here the ilium. Okay, so I'm on both sides here. And when people tell you to put your hands on your hip bone, right, that's the iliac crest, so it's part of the ilium. So you also have right here the pubis, right? And this is where many of the muscles of the inner thigh will attach, right? So like if you get a groin pull, right, you feel it up there because that's, where those muscles are attaching. And then you also have the ischium, so which is a little bit lower, a little bit more to the back side of the pelvis, but lower. And like your sit bone, right, the ischial tuberosity, that's part of the ischium. So those are the three major structures of the pelvis itself. And then you have this funny looking bone right here, which is called the sacrum, and that's really just a bunch of fused bones that has formed this particular design, but that attaches to the pelvis here at the sacroiliac joint, or the SI joint. And then, of course, sitting on top of that is the lumbar spine, right? So the lumbar spine is the only is the part of the spine right in the low back where the ribs do not attach. So this is the complex that we are addressing today, in how some of those muscles and fascial tissues that attach to that region can have a direct effect on certain movement patterns, and whether or not you have pain and so on. Now, that region it helps enable us to stand upright, okay, and walk on our legs, on two legs. And that's one thing that really helps distinguish us, obviously other than appearance, from apes, is the fact that we have, very large gluteus maximus muscles, which is a big reason for us to be able to stand upright and walk on two legs. Now, other primates can walk on two legs, but it's only for a brief period of time. And it's because this structure is not designed to allow for that, and especially with the gluteus maximus muscle, right, the glute max, that's not nowhere near as large relative to their body compared to how ours is with our body. So that's a big reason why we can stand upright for long periods of time, while we're designed to walk upright. Now, this region can actually move in all three planes. right? It can, move forward, move to the side, can, rotate. So, and that's very important because when the tissues are, chronically shortened, right? They're feeling tight. That's going to limit a lot of that movement and ultimately can lead to some of the pains you may be currently experiencing, or hopefully you don't experience it, but you may encounter down the road. So we want to make sure we address that. If you feel tightness in the hips, you want to address it much sooner than later so that you can avoid those issues down the road. And, again, I've mentioned in our previous videos, which if you haven't seen yet, go ahead and check those out related to the foot and ankle complex and the knee. But the kinetic chain, right, runs through the body from ground up, and it's really just, again, an alternating pattern of stability and mobility with each region, right? The foot being stable, the ankle being mobile, the knee is supposed to be stable, right? And now we're dealing with the this whole complex, right, where the hip joint itself is supposed to be mobile, but the lumbar spine is supposed to be more stable, right? So when that's off, that's where you're going to get a lot of these issues you may have experienced already. And because of that kinetic chain, right, it's going to function optimally when the pelvis can actually come over the legs and under the spine correctly, right? So if you're hunched forward, that's going to throw things off tremendously. Or if you're maybe over rotating or not rotating enough, right, through that region, like when you're walking, then again, it's going to throw things off and lead to injury. And when it comes to the pelvis, if it's in, now there's a natural anterior pelvic tilt, right? So in other words, the front side will angle downwards a little bit, right? And when that is excessive, right? So it kind of gives the appearance of you sticking your butt back behind you. When that's excessive, that's going to really throw everything off in that complex, right? And not to mention, it's going to affect the knees and the foot and ankle. It's also going to affect the spine above it, as well as your head and neck position, right? So it's very important that we do address the lumbopelvic hip complex or girdle, because just that excessive anterior tilt, that forward tilt, it's certainly going to put a lot more stress on that lumbar spine, the lower back, right? And just throw everything else off of its alignment. And oftentimes, you might have, let's say, knee pain that can be attributed to what's going on in the hips, right? Same thing with the spine. The pelvic region, can also directly impact that. And another thing we have to understand is that with that excessive tilt, that forward tilt, right? The abs, right? The rectus abdominis, the six-pack abs, or eight-pack, for some people, right? That will attach to the pubis that I showed you earlier, right? On the pelvis. And so when the pelvis is tilted forward too much, it's going to pull the abs with it, and then it's going to make it difficult to stand upright, nice and tall. Okay, so that's another reason why we need to make sure we address that, because if it's going to affect the way you stand, I mean, you can imagine how everything else will be impacted. So when the pelvis shifts, shifts, we also understand that it's going to adjust, affect the rib cage, and therefore the rib cage is going to have to adjust. Okay, and if the rib cage is going to adjust, you can imagine that could also affect your breathing, because the diaphragm, right, which sits just below the, like right at the bottom of the rib cage, just below the lungs, right, that's also going to be impacted, so you won't be able to breathe as well, or have efficient breathing, as we should. And incorrect breathing certainly will have negative effects, with the pelvis and the spine, right? Because now it's not going to, because of the poor alignment, right? It's not going to, the muscles aren't going to function the way they're supposed to, like that. The diaphragm specifically won't function the way it's supposed to. You'll end up using other muscles to draw in the air, such as shrugging when you take a deep breath in, and then exhaling. So we don't want the muscles around the shoulder complex to do a lot of the breathing for us, right? We want the diaphragm to do a lot of that. That's why, we've heard of like deep belly breathing, so that we can help get that region stronger, for more efficient breathing. So yeah, just because you have poor posture, like, oh yeah, I have poor posture, I just, my back is rounded, whatever. understand it's going to affect so much more than just your height, right? Yeah, you feel like you lose a couple inches, but it's going to affect your breathing. It's going to affect so much more. And with the lumbo-pelvic hip girdle, okay, or the complex, that alignment and function is crucial to having like correct function throughout the body, kind of like what I've been mentioning, and that's going to include the muscles, right? The muscle tissue, the fascial tissue, the your internal health, because also too, depending on your posture, right? If things are a little bit more crunched, like if let's say the abs are a little bit more shortened, okay, then that's going to crush a lot of the organs inside. So again, everything is going to be thrown off. It's not going to function optimally. I just mentioned your breathing, how that's going to be off, and even just our daily functional capacity, right? It's going to be harder to do what we would normally consider to be mundane and trivial. You'll notice that now one day it's not as easy as it once was. So moving on to some of the hip flexors, right? Those are the muscles that help you pull your knee forward, right? They help you take that forward step. And they're generally going to be in front of the hips. And those, believe it or not, right, if they're feeling tight, we usually associate tightness with maybe too strong. Well, in this case, oftentimes it's not because they're tight, it's actually because they're weak, right? Believe it or not, they're not strong. So, those hip flexors we need to address, not necessarily overloading with hip flexion, right, but with a lot of stretching so that they're not so tight. And, on that, two of the most common deviations for that lumbopelvic hip girdle will be excessive anterior pelvic tilt, right? That forward tilt, too much of it. Because again, naturally there is a little bit of a tilt. Okay, we're not perfectly straight up and down. It's a little bit of a tilt, but when that's excessive, that can cause problems. The second most common deviation will be excessive lumbar lordosis. Now, I will say this with that excessive tilt, that excessive lordosis or that excessive curvature in the low back will be a given, right? So if you're tilted too far back, right, you can see now the tailbone kind of sticks out more, and it's just a lot more stress on that low back. So we got to be very careful there. If you have that excessive tilt, we need to work on the posterior tilt or tilting more back behind you. So you're tucking your tailbone, tucking the glutes underneath your torso, underneath your spine. So that can help correct that. But, when you're stuck in that position for so long, it's hard to get the tailbone to tuck underneath. So there are exercises that we will work on to help you do that better, right? Do that more efficiently. The lumbopelvic hip complex is very complex. There's so much going on there, and there are more than 15 muscle groups that are working within that area that attach to that region. And if we break it down to 4 groups, right, you're going to have like the gluteal group, right? So obviously with the glute max, but we also have like the glute medius, the glute minimus, right? We also have the lateral rotator muscles. Okay, so it'll help you rotate the leg through the hip joints, right? We also have the abductor or adductor group. So abduction, adduction. That's abduction is pulling away. Adduction is moving in towards the midline of the body, right? So moving in. And so like the inner thigh muscles will help you pull in, of course. You have some of the glutes, another muscle, the TFL, that pulls away, right? So you have that's attached to the hip that allows important movement through the joint. And you also have the Iliopsoas group. Now, the Iliopsoas group are often associated, with hip flexion, right? So the tight hip flexors I was telling you about, that is part of that group. And I'll get into it a little bit more as to how that will also impact your low back. But the key muscle groups that directly impact the lumbopelvic hip girdle, will include muscles like the erector spinae, right? These muscles run along the spine, right, up the back, and they do attach to a thick, tissue here in the low back called the thoracolumbar fascia. I don't expect you to remember that, but that thick tissue, there are a lot of muscles that attach to it, such as some of those rectus spinae muscles, even like the lats, right? Those wrap right down and attach to that region. The abdominal muscles, right, because they attach to the pubis, so that's going to have an impact on the pelvis, and then vice versa. The hip flexors, as I mentioned, the glutes, TFL, hamstrings, right? They're the back of the thigh because that actually does attach to the bottom of the hips. And then same thing, or not the hips, but the pelvis. And then same thing with the adductors, right? The inner thigh muscles. So those are some of the areas that we will address with our exercises. Now, everything in the body is connected, right? It all works together as one cohesive unit, right? So muscles rarely ever work in isolation. That's why we want to focus much on movement patterns, right? And many of the muscles, the same muscles that create like stability for the foot and ankle complex, and for the knee, also do the same for the lumbopelvic hip girdle, okay? And one key muscle that I do want to point out is the psoas major. It's one of the iliopsoas muscles. And a little fact, it's the only muscle that attaches the upper body to the lower body, right? So we think, well, that doesn't make sense because it seems like that we have a lot of that, but no, not really, because the psoas actually attaches to the low back from inside, right, from the front, and then attaches down, runs through the pelvis, right, the pelvic girdle, and attaches to the thigh bone, right, the femur. So it actually attaches both upper body and lower body without necessarily directly attached to the pelvis. And when that's shortened, right? When that muscle is shortened and it's feeling tight, what's going to happen is it can cause low back issues, right? So even though it's a major muscle for doing this, right, and for stepping forward, it can cause low back issues if it's tight. And it's going to cause the hip to be out of alignment, right, and the pelvis and joints to be out of alignment, and believe it or not, that can also affect performance in the bedroom too, right? So just because things are going to be off alignment, things aren't going to function as properly as they should, even with blood circulation, what have you, that's going to affect everything in that general region. So it is an important area to look into, especially if you're feeling low back pain. The psoas, the iliopsoas group can certainly be a big contributor to that. Now, the glutes, all right, we talked about hip flexion. The glutes, right, the glute maximus specifically, is the most important muscle for hip extension or going back, right? So you're squeezing the glute by moving the leg back. And what we often experience is what's called glute amnesia, right? So we know amnesia when you forget things, right? And glute amnesia is very common, and especially for people who sit too much, right? Or don't train the glutes, right? They don't work them out nearly enough as they should during their activities and in strength training. So that's one of the most common issues we run into. But also we have, inhibited glutes. In other words, they kind of shut down indefinitely, right? So they're not firing, they're not functioning the way we want them to, right? And they don't contract with the activities that we do, including, sports, right? And if you're not going to get good glute function, that's certainly going to impact your performance. So very important that we strengthen the glutes. Because also, too, when you have, well, actually, this is going to lead into this third part here, overshadowed glutes, right? So they, like when the glutes activate, they'll activate a little bit when they're like the overshadowed glutes, they'll activate a little bit, but they're much weaker than some of the muscles in the legs, like the hamstrings, for example, right? If the glutes don't do the load they're supposed to, something has to take its place, which oftentimes the hamstrings will do with certain movements. So that's a compensation that will take place. Sometimes the low back may have to take over that loading as well, right? So there's compensation. Also, you can have inefficient movement because the glutes aren't doing what they're supposed to do. They're not pulling things the way they're supposed to pull. And of course, that can lead to injury and pain. If you're not experiencing it now, then sometime soon if it's not addressed. The And there's a relationship here too with the psoas major and in the glute activation, right? So the psoas will directly affect the activation in the glutes. So if the iliacus and psoas major, that's the iliopsoas group, if they're feeling tight, right, they're chronically shortened, then the glutes won't properly activate because of the changes in the muscle length, right, the joint angles, as well as the efficiency of your natural movement, right? So it's certainly going to throw the alignment off. And anytime the alignment's off, that means the tissues, the length is, either too lengthened or it's too short, so you can't get the proper pull. There's an imbalance there. And another thing that many of us don't realize is that tight hips and fat storage kind of go hand in hand, right? Believe it or not. So the going back to that psoas major, right? That major hip flexor muscle, it's very involved with the fight or flight response, and a tight psoas muscle kind of signals, danger to your body, right? Because, think of being curled up in the fetal position, right? We try to protect our body, especially like the internal organs, you just curl up. And again, that triggers that fight or flight response, right? So, the hormones, the stress hormones start to elevate, as a result, right? Your body goes into that survival state. And as a result, you're more likely to store fat because with the stress hormones being elevated, your body's going to want to store the energy because it feels like it's going to need it down the road, right? Just like if there's a famine, your body starts to understand we're not eating as much, that we can't just burn through the food or the energy that we have in our body. We need to slow down that metabolism to store. So that's the kind of effect that's going on there with the tight hips, right? Your body's getting signal for that. So it's again, another reason to address your hips if they're feeling tight, right? Again, just so many things that can go on here. It's not just, oh, I feel tight, I can't step as well. It's much more than that. So now that we've, and then sitting a lot can certainly do that. Staying in certain positions, can certainly lead to, even standing too much, right, can lead to, tightness in certain muscles in the lumbopelvic hip girdle. So, but let's move into some of the corrective movements that you can perform to help alleviate some of that tightness that's going on in the hips, right, and the pelvis, the low back, and so on. So I'm going to start with the self-myofascial release techniques, and we'll start with the quadriceps. We're going to use a foam roller for this. So I'm going to use this right here. You can also use a massage gun, which I'll show you briefly. But with the foam roller, what we'll do is you can start with placing both legs on the roller itself so that the middle of the thigh is right on top. And when we roll up and down, we're going between the hip and the knees. We're never crossing over the knee on the foam roller. All right, you can kind of roll onto one side to emphasize one part of that front thigh. Same thing with the other side. Okay, and what I often like to do too to enhance the intensity here is I like to have one leg on that foam roller. And if you have a smaller foam roller, shorter foam roller, then this is probably a more reasonable approach anyway. But you can have your knee on the floor to help with your leverage. You can pick the knee up to allow for more pressure to be applied. Roll to the outside of the front thigh. Same thing with the inside of the front thigh, right? So go ahead and explore that region. And the reason why that can be very important, especially the middle of that thigh, is you have a muscle called the rectus femoris, right? So it's one of the quadriceps muscles. And it's the only quadriceps muscle that actually attaches to the pelvis, right? So when that is also feeling very tight, right, it could be shortened, that's also going to have an impact on that pelvic alignment. So quadriceps, especially in the front, is going to be a very good one to work on. Same thing with the massage gun, right? It's going to get a little loud here, but set it to whatever setting if you have this anyway. and just working. Just let it float on top, right? You don't need to dig into the muscle tissue. And if you find those knots, right, those adhesions, just stay on top of that for a little bit until you start to feel it release. All right, start to relax a little more, and then you can slowly move on to the next spot. But we're going to work on the adductors, the adductors, aka inner thigh. We're going to use the foam roller once again. This time, I'm going to have it running in line with my body. I'm going to lie down on the floor. I'm still resting on my elbow, though, to keep myself up. And then I'm going to bend my hip about 90 degrees, knee roughly 90 degrees as well. And again, between the knee and the hip, I'm going to roll. So side, inside and out. And especially if you don't target this area that often, you might feel this is a little more sensitive, right? So make sure that you do take your time. Stay on those adhesions if you find any, right? Those trigger points. Breathe through. Breathing is very important, right? Breathing in through the nose, out through the mouth to allow the body to relax. When that sensation, right? Sometimes it may feel like it hurts, but when that starts to alleviate, then you can slowly move on, to the next part of that region. So of course, you're going to do both sides. I'm just going to flip to the other side here. And same thing, just in and out. Find those adhesions. Breathe through them. And if you feel like it's too much pressure, you don't want to maintain that pressure for too long, because that will certainly trigger your body to tense up and try to protect itself. So apply enough pressure that you can tolerate, but still can be effective. All right. If you especially if it's to the point where you're struggling to breathe, it's way too intense. So ease off of that pressure. And that's true for any of these regions that we're targeting. And the next region we'll target will be the glutes, right? The gluteal complex, primarily the glute max. And I'm going to have you sit on the foam roller for this one. What we'll do is I'm going to have you cross your leg so that if you can comfortably get in this position, the ankle will be just above the knee, right? So a figure 4. And what we'll do then is just gently roll, keeping it entirely in that glute complex. So we're not going to the low back here. What I like to do is also roll a little bit more to the side, because the glute max is a big muscle. It's a very large muscle, and it attaches right there to the outer hip, right? So it goes from the low back across that pelvic complex in the back and attaches to the outer hip. So, there's a wide region there. And so again, don't hesitate to sit right on top, right? Even near where the sit bone is, right? Going to, maybe the top of the pelvis, again, not the low back, and eventually work your way more to the outside by rolling onto that side. So I know, speaking of sides, that's how you're seeing me, is just from the side. So just so that you can see, right, I have one foot down, and again, leg is crossed, and I'm falling onto the open side, right, the unsupported side. And that's how I'm able to target the glutes there. All right, and then same thing with the other side. So my left leg is up, I'm rolling onto the left hip, okay, in that region. So that's one I like to do a lot for my hips, is that particular exercise. So the next thing I'm going to do is show you something for both the sacrum and pelvis. So remember I was showing you earlier where that one weird looking bone, right, the sacrum, attaches to the pelvis, right, the SI joint. So this is a good way to kind of target that area. If you have something that may not be this is about 6 inches, so if you have something that might be like 4 or 5, it might be a little bit better, but nonetheless, I'm going to keep the foam roller directly underneath that region, so where that sacrum is, right? It's still in the pelvis, it's not in the low back, but it's like the top of the pelvis without crossing over. And I'm just going to roll gently from side to side with my feet in the air. As you can see, my knees are bent. And this can help relax this area, get a little bit of a release. And again, if you find an adhesion, right, you can really feel it, then you can stay on top of it until it starts to release. You can also do circles too. If you target one side, like I'm on my left side, I'm just doing small circles, right, moving through the hip joints. And then you can reverse direction. And then once you do that, for a handful of repetitions, you can do the same thing for the other side, right? Because this is also going to help improve some of that mobility that you might be lacking through the hips. So remember, just reverse direction as well. So sometimes, you may feel that there's some stickiness in that area, and I like doing that particular movement with the roller just to help ease that up a little bit, so it doesn't feel as gummed up or as tight. And now for the abductors, the abductors, right, the outer hips. I'm going to show you with the lacrosse ball. So we're going to use just one lacrosse ball, and I'm going to rest on my side. Now I'm going to place the ball right there on the outer hip, and then just gently roll onto it. And right away, I'm already feeling this. So just kind of probe around to make sure you are getting those trigger points. And once you're there, breathe through it. And then you can slowly move on to the next location. But we're staying right there to the outside of that hip joint. Oh. Right, and it's not surprising if you feel this. I think most people will feel this one. You can also lie a little flatter as well. And then, of course, we'll switch over to the other side. So one thing I didn't mention earlier is when you are doing this, and make sure you stay on the fleshy part, by the way, the fleshy part of that region. You don't want to be directly on the bone. But when you're doing the self-myofascial release, I mentioned the amount of pressure, right? So not only if you have too much pressure, can it cause the tissues to tense up and actually have the opposite effect of what we're looking for, but also if you stay on too long, right? So we want to try to limit to about 2 minutes for each location. And you can go anywhere between 30 seconds to 2 minutes, but up to 2 minutes can certainly have a positive effect. And because we're not perfectly balanced, if you do feel one side much more than the other, just like I mentioned before, you can put more focus on that particular side. So even if it's like a 2-to-1 ratio, like 1 minute on one side, 2 minutes on the other side, or 45 seconds, 90 seconds, whatever would work for you. You can absolutely break it up like that, but definitely give attention, a little bit more attention to the side that needs it much more. All right, now let's go ahead. We're going to get the low back, and we'll use the lacrosse ball once again. We're going to need one lacrosse ball for this. You can use a tennis ball. You can use, any type of ball like that, a sports ball, right? Even like a racket ball. So what we'll do now is I'm just rolling onto my left side to pick up the right, and I'm going to place the ball right there underneath where my low back is, but not on the spine. We're just going to be to the right of the spine, and then go ahead and lay down on top of it. All right, so it's going to be between the rib cage and the top of the pelvis. Eyes should be looking up to the ceiling. If you need a little bit of head support, right, or neck support, go ahead. You can place like a folded towel or something to that effect right underneath your head to help with your neck alignment. From here, I'm separating my feet. Same thing with the knees. And then I'm going to take the left knee. Remember, ball's on my right side. Take the left knee and let that drop in towards my right leg. So bring it back up in towards my right leg. And that's going to help to put a little bit more pressure on that spot in the right back, right low back. All right, you can do that for a handful of repetitions, and then you would switch and do the same for the other side. So again, make sure you get it in the right spot so it's not on the spine, it's not on the hip or the pelvis, not on the ribs. And then same thing, drop that right knee in towards the left. You can do some repetitions. And for the next movements, this I would have you use two. If you have two sports balls, this would be perfect. So you're going to place them both in that low back. And again, the spine should be right in between, so never on the spine. And we're going to hang out here, allowing the tissues to settle into position. You want to make it a little bit more challenging. You can also just kind of tilt the pelvis so that you're lifting your tailbone up from the floor, right? You can even add maybe just a very, very small side-to-side movement. But this is going to help get a little bit deeper into that low back region, because we do have a muscle that does run up and down called the Quadriceps lumborum, or the QL. This can help hit that area. But let's go ahead and we'll move on from that spot. And then, especially if you're feeling a lot of low back discomfort, that could be a very good one for you to try out when the tissues aren't too sensitive, right? So you want to make sure that, again, before you start any of these, that your doctor or physical therapist is giving you the okay if you're already experiencing pain. So let's go ahead and move on to some stretching, and I'm going to have you start by first getting some water, especially if you go through some self-massage techniques. It's a good idea to hydrate, or you want to hydrate some of those tissues that we just worked on. And now for the stretching, you're going to start on the floor for this one. This is going to be a kneeling hip flexor stretch, and we're going to stay in this position for a little bit. So, excuse me, make sure that you have some sort of padding, maybe a folded towel or blanket, maybe even a pillow, because you're going to be down on one knee, let me reposition here, bringing 1 foot forward. I want this front foot so that the knee stays directly on top of the ankle. Next, sometimes you drink water and it just, goes down the wrong way, right? So your toes on the front foot are pointing forward. My back foot, I have my toes tucked, okay? So I want this back leg to be pointing the same direction as my front foot. And now I'm standing nice and tall here, or kneeling nice and tall rather. And I'm keeping, let's see, I think this is the better side here. I'm keeping this hip directly on top of the knee, right? So the kneeling knee. You want the hip stacked over it. Tall chest, spine nice and tall. So I'm nice and upright here as best as you can. I understand some people, maybe you can't get up that high. Do the best you can by pulling the shoulder blades back. But then you're going to squeeze this glute. So this is my left side, by the way. So you're going to squeeze that left glute, tucking the tailbone and glute underneath your spine. Okay, so that is going to help give you that stretch that you're looking for. You might feel some of this in the quadriceps. Remember, one of the muscles in the quadriceps is the hip flexor. So that's nice and simple, right? Pulling forward. The next thing we can do is, if you already feeling a big stretch from this, you don't need to do the next part. But you can progress by raising the arm up overhead. Keep the arm close to the ear as best as you can. Again, keep the abs contracted. From here, we can add a little bit of a bend away from the stretch. So I'm bending to my right while stretching the left, right in front of the hip. And then the other part of this would be adding a rotation. So you're reaching and twisting to the right and then bringing it back. Okay, so I just showed you a stretch that you can do for all three planes, right? So you're stretching the front, back, you're stretching the side or the lateral plane, and you're stretching in the rotational plane or the transverse plane. So we're going to do the same thing here. Again, other leg. Keep your hips stacked over your knee, right? Nice and vertical line there between the two. Tuck your tailbone in, squeeze the right glutes. Make sure you get that stretch right in front of the hip joint. You don't even have to move forward and back for this one, right? You can just stay in this position and feel that stretch. So again, I'm going to raise my right arm up to the ceiling, keeping it as straight as I can. Sometimes, you have a bent elbow and you may not get as much of a stretch. You want to straighten it out as much as you can so you can really get that line of fascial tissue that runs down the side as well. And then again, we can add a little bit of a side bend to enhance that stretch if you're not already feeling a significant stretch. And then we can also add a rotation as you reach to the other side. Good. And you'll notice too, as you're going through that, it's not just a good stretch for the hip flexors, but it can also be a good strengthening exercise for the glutes, right? So the glutes are going to be a big part of that. Remember, the glutes help you extend the hip, right? While we're trying to stretch the front of the hip that's flexed. Next, we're going to do a sideline, sideline hip flexor. No, I don't want to do that one. So the adductors, here's what we'll do. Hands and knees. So we'll start head on here with you. And I'm going to have you take one leg. We're going to bring it out to the side, right? So my hip is stacked over the knee here, this leg. Trying to keep the knee comfortably straight. Toes are going to point straight forward. And right here, you may already feel a stretch in the inner thigh, right? You can enhance that stretch by gently moving the hips back while trying to maintain your flat back. And slowly bring it back up. So from the side, again, my knee is directly underneath my hip, hand shoulder width apart, and then try to maintain the flat back as much as I can. It's more about getting the hips to move back rather than sitting down, right? So maintain the flat back as best you can, and then reset. So this is a great stretch, not just for the inner thigh, but also a good way to work on some of the mobility in your hip joint as well. And now we'll move on to we'll stretch the glutes, and I'm going to show you through the pigeon pose, right? This is something that you might see in yoga. And how I like to set myself into this position is I start in the high plank, I pull one leg forward, but you'll notice what I do is I kind of turn, I rotate the thigh so that my lower leg comes forward, and then from here, I slide my back leg into position so that I can start to feel this more in the hips, more in the glutes. All right. If you can maintain a good spinal alignment, you can even bring it down softly into your elbows and forearms. If you're rounding your back too much to do that, stay up on your hands. Again, relax into the stretch, and let's go ahead and switch. I mean, I'm going through this more abbreviated, right? So we're not in these positions for too long. I just want to show you the movements that you can do as part of your routine, your corrective exercise routine. But do not forget to breathe with any stretch you do. Just because you hold a stretch doesn't mean you hold your breath, right? So let's slowly bring it out. And another glute stretch I'm going to show you will get you on your feet. So I'll show you from the front, I'll also show you from the side. But what you'll do is you're going to separate your feet and you're going to bring it down into like a partial lunge, right? So you're not coming all the way down, just a partial lunge. But my right leg is forward. What I'll do is take the left arm and reach across so that my hand is just to the outside of the knee, or just above the knee, the outside of the thigh. And now I can add a little bit of a stretch on that right side. All right. If you want, you can come out of it, back down. You can do repetitions of this. And then, of course, if you're doing, let's say, 8 to 10 reps, then you can do the same thing on the other side. So make sure that back knee is bent a little bit as you come down to get that stretch. and bring it up, and then back down, and up. And then, of course, you can step into this as well, right? Whoops. Sometimes on the mat, you can lose your balance, right? But you come down to that stretch, then stand up, whether you stay on the same leg or you alternate, either is fine. But that's a good one to where you'll still get some strengthening in for the thighs, the hips, while stretching the glutes. So now what we'll do is something for the piriformis. It's one of the muscles that's a little bit deeper in the hip on the back side, and sometimes can be a reason for that sciatic nerve pain that you experience, right? The sciatica. So what you can do is you can do this sitting on a chair. I'm going to show you on the floor. So my legs out in front, knees are bent. I'm going to cross one leg over the other, kind of like what we did earlier when we were on the foam roller, right? So my ankle is just above the knee. And if you're sitting in a chair, you can just bring your chest down towards your leg. If you're sitting on the floor like I am, you can hug your leg, bring your leg towards you as you bring your chest in towards the leg. But watch your back. Again, there might be some slight curving forward, and that's fine. Just make sure it's not excessive to where, you get that big hunch in your back. So try to keep your back not perfectly flat, but you're trying to keep it as long as you can, as tall as you can, as you come in and do that stretch. So same thing. Pull your leg in towards your chest. Bring your chest in towards your leg. And as you can imagine, the more bend you have in that supporting leg, right, the more of a stretch you may get from that, right, because it's going to be a little bit harder position to get yourself into. And we're going to switch gears here and move on to the stability exercises, okay? Something that's going to help you work on, it's going to be a little bit of the core as well, but this will help you stabilize the hip joint. Starting with the bird dog, this is a common one, so you may have done this a few times in the past. But on your hands and knees, again, trying to maintain hips stacked over the knees, same thing with the shoulders over the wrists. And what we'll do is keep one leg straight back behind you, right, so that you're squeezing the glute, right? You're not activating the low back, you're trying to minimize that as much as possible. So squeeze that glute to get the leg back behind you, and then extend the opposite arm forward. So then you can bring both limbs in and switch, do the same for the other side. So because we have, a couple limbs off of the floor, we're forced to balance, right? And this is like an anti-rotation exercise, as well as a glute strengthening and mobility exercise. And you'll see I'm pushing through my heel, right? So my toes point down towards the floor. I push through the heel to get the leg straight. It's not about getting the leg up as high as possible. When you do that, this low back is going to start to arch. Okay, it's going to start to really curve, and we're trying to avoid that. You want to keep it as neutral as you can, so that's all in the glute. So you want to squeeze that glute as you get the leg back behind you. If you feel your low back, then you're using too much low back, and see if your leg is coming up too high, right? Because that oftentimes will be the case. But just reach for the wall behind you, not to the ceiling. So next, we're going to do what's called the bear plank, and we're going to pick up, here, I'll show you. Let's just get right into the position, right? So for the bear plank, same starting position as the bird dog, right? Hips over the knees, shoulders over the wrists. From here, with your toes down into the floor, you're going to lift your knees off of the floor a couple inches, so probably like the length of your foot, right? So that your shin is parallel to the floor. And then what we'll do is pick up one hand and then the other, right? So if you can see head on, right, picking up one hand and then the other. Keeping your hands shoulder width apart, directly underneath your shoulder. And you try to hold, if you can, for 1 to 2 seconds, right? As you get a little bit stronger in that position, then you can hold it for a little bit longer. But it's very important that we maintain that flat back, right? So that we're not arching the low back, right? You don't want that caving in. Also, one of the main goals here too is to try to stabilize that pelvis so it's not rotating from one side to the other, right? So there's going to be because of the balance, you might rotate the pelvis a little bit, but when you're starting to do this, then that's going to be a bit excessive. So continue to work on that, right? It's going to take practice with that exercise. All right. And then you can always progress that too by picking up the opposite leg, kind of like the bird dog, right? So if you pick up arm and leg, right? So it's going to be a similar concept. It's just a progression from what I showed you. So now let's work a little bit on mobility. And so again, we went through the self-myofascial release. We did some stretching. We just did a couple stability-based movements. So now we're going to work on mobilizing that region, right? The hips especially. And internal, external hip rotation. I'm going to do this on the floor. You're going to lie on your back. All right, make sure that your low back is comfortably in position, right? If it's bothering you too much, then one, you may need to support your head. Two, we can also do this standing so that this doesn't bother you so much. But keeping your feet maybe slightly wider than the hips, turn using your thigh, right? Your femur. Turn that inward so the toes will end up pointing inward as well. And then you're going to turn them outward, right? So again, turn using the thigh bone or the femur, in and out. This is a great way to work on those rotator muscles that help the hip, right? Help the leg rotate. Clearly, that's the motion we're performing. But you should be able to feel this really deep near the hip, or really deep, near where that sit bone is. You might feel it around there. Very good. And again, you can do that standing as well, right? You might want to have something to support yourself so you can stand tall. You don't have to, but just turning the toes out and then in, keeping the heel down, almost like you're squashing a bug with your heel, right? But again, keep yourself tall, shoulders back. And then you can just do that for the same thing on the other side. So pretty straightforward. So I'm not going to say it's easy, because if you are experiencing a lot of tightness in that area, you're going to find it very difficult to either turn the toe out or even bring it in. So, I've worked with clients who they're just stuck in the hips. They can't even do this, right? It's all up here. So this is a good one to really practice to get those muscles to function and get unstuck, if you will. But the next movements, we're going to do the hip rock. We kind of did this already with the inner thigh, but if we're on the hands and knees once again, all right, back on all fours, and maintaining a flat back as we move the hips back behind you, and then reset. If you notice that you're starting to curl, right, your butt and your tailbone starting to tuck underneath right away, widen your legs a little bit further. So make it a bit easier to maintain that neutral position. Right. So again, if you start tucking, just separate the knees. And this is a good way, again, to work on that mobilization through your hip joints, or in your hip joints. Okay. Now, what we'll do next is a multi-directional leg swing. So like this one, this is a good one to stand for. And if you have a bar, even a wall to hold on to, then that will certainly work for you. But what we'll do is swing the leg in and out, right? So you'll certainly work on the lateral motion here, right? And then another thing you can do too is maybe with the bar or the wall to your side is kind of moving forward and back, right? But watch that you're not using the low back for this, because if you're kicking back and the low back is really curving, really arching, then you're gonna, you'll probably feel that discomfort, but you're not going to use the glutes the way you're supposed to. So make sure that you're feeling that squeeze in the glute as you bring the leg back, minimal to nothing in the low back. All right. Good, good. So now let's work on a few strengthening exercises for that area. And the mule kick with the bent knee. So I like this one. And this is going to be a little different from like the bird dog in that your knee will stay bent about 90 degrees. So as we're down, hands and knees once again, We'll then, moving through the hip joint, bring the foot up towards the ceiling and then slowly down. And this is one you have to really pay attention to that low back. So if you keep those abs engaged, right, pull the navel in towards your spine to stabilize your trunk, then you can squeeze the glute as you bring that leg up, keeping your knee about 90 degrees. So you can do that for, however many repetitions you want, whether it be 10, be 15 reps in that range. But pay attention to your movement. If you need a mirror to kind of see if you're rounding, or not rounding, but the arching your low back, you can do that, and you can usually feel it. But yeah, just foot up to the ceiling, knee bent 90 degrees, and it's a good way to get the glutes really engaged. But also, we're going to do the bridge. So if you're on your back, feet will stay roughly hip width apart. Make sure that the toes are pointing forward. So many of us tend to have the toes point outward, right? It just feels natural because we're so used to being in that position. So, and I had to address that, in previous videos. But, take a look to see where your toes are pointing and try to get them to point forward. Shoulders will stay down, and see if you can pin, right, the shoulder blades down into the floor as well. I like to keep the palms face up because it puts the shoulders in a better alignment. And then from here, with the knees same distance apart as the feet are, you're going to pick those hips up, squeezing the glutes at the very top, trying to get a nice straight alignment from knee all the way down to the shoulders, and then slowly return down to touch the floor. Again, pick it up to the ceiling and down. Again, the goal is to get the hips, right, to be straighter from the thigh through the lumbo-pelvic hip complex all the way down to the shoulders. Return down. You can hold it up here for a set time if you like. You can do repetitions if you like. And then there are ways to progress from this, such as doing single leg bridge. You can keep yourself in that bridge and just take lateral steps, right? So there are different ways to really strengthen that hip complex just with the bridge alone. So, and then you can also use like one of those larger inflatable stability balls. You can do some leg curls. You can do bridges on that. So there's all sorts of movements that you can do just with the bridge pattern. But we're going to move on to the clamshell. This is going to be great for that hip joint. So when you position yourself, ideally, if you can position yourself up against the wall so that your head, your shoulders, your back, hips, and feet are up against the wall, that would be ideal because that will keep you in that perfect alignment. So let's go ahead, position yourself so that your feet are in line with your hips, back, and head. Watch that you don't have your head forward. You're going to pull it back a little bit, let it rest, all right, on your hands or on your arm, whatever's comfortable. And I like to have the top hand on the floor just to allow me to hold my position. From here with the feet on top of each other, I'm going to take that top leg, pull the knee away from the floor, and then slowly return down. One of the common things that will happen is as you pick that knee up is you tend to roll backwards. Another reason why it's nice to have the wall because it will keep you in place so you're not rolling back. So keep the hips stacked one over the other and just move through that hip joint of the top leg, top hip. And then, of course, just do the same thing for the other side. And I like this one a lot if I want to feel the hips getting worked. This is certainly one that will do it. If you're in the correct alignment, this will be very, very beneficial for you. You can add a challenge to this by holding it up, right, and trying to keep it there for a set number of seconds, what have you. You can also use the resistance loop for this too, all right, if you have it positioned. And I would definitely start with something that's light. But if you have that just above the knees, again, doing the same thing so that you have some sort of resistance to work with. All right, and one more movement for today is going to be the fire hydrant. And this is kind of a similar concept where we're working on the outer hips. Well, actually, you'll feel the outer hips more so than you did with the clamshell. But hands and knees, once again, And from here, we're going to move that leg. We're going to pull it away out to the side, trying to maintain 90 degrees in your knee from the front. All right, just going to pull it out. And watch your pelvis, right? Really think about this. You know, are you turning your pelvis to get the leg up, or are you allowing the leg move through that hip joint? Because you want to stabilize your pelvis so you're not rolling it. All right, so this could be a good stabilizing muscle for the pelvis as well, or the hips, as well as a strengthening exercise for the opposite hip. So, but we just went through quite a bit today, and if you are still with us, I appreciate you sticking around. But that will be it for today's corrective exercise segment related to the lumbopelvic hip girdle. And I hope you took away a lot from this, and hope you're able to apply it to yourself. So good luck, enjoy, and have a wonderful day.